Hello and good evening. My name is Daniel Cunningham. I am a horticulturist at Rooted In, and along with my colleague Patrick Dickinson, we are excited to present this evening our online program, Wise Watering, the what, where, when, and why of landscape water use. So, everything you need to know about watering your plants, especially critical during these summer months. And we are excited to be sponsored tonight by our friends at Water is Awesome. Well, without further ado, let's go ahead and dig in. Now, one of the things that we want to do in our classes and our programs that we offer through Rooted In is help people overcome the challenges to growing plants in Texas. And certainly we know that there's a lot of those. We've experienced extreme heat and extreme cool temperatures and drought and flooding and all different types of challenges here recently within the past couple of years. And so extreme weather is one of those. And as rainfall and precipitation plays into that, it can really be a limiting factor to plant growth. Now, weeds also compete with our plants for not only sunlight and nutrients, but also for water. And so we'll want to address those as well as our gardens progress. Pest insects can also be challenging in terms of just eating the tissue of our plants. Now, most insects are either beneficial or benign, but there are some that we want to control, but we want to make sure we do that in the right way, being good stewards of our environment. And then water, again, I mentioned it is the most limiting factor to plant growth. And so if we can get that right, then everything else kind of becomes easier throughout the garden and the landscape. Now, I wanted to address where we actually get our water from. When you run your sprinklers or when you turn on your water faucet outdoors, it's actually coming mostly from our nearby lakes and reservoirs. And although we're doing pretty good, but most of Texas is not any kind of drought right now, we have limited water in those lakes. It's like a reservoir of water. And if we use it up faster than it's filling up, then we can kind of get into some trouble. We'll talk about that in more detail, but we should want to not only protect the water in our lakes so we can use it for boating and recreation and fishing and all that, but just so that we have plenty in case we do run into a drought, whether that's in the next month or next year or what have you. So using these good practices, not only will your garden look great, but then we'll have plenty of water to use for washing your hair. Maybe those watching tonight, not me, but washing dishes and brushing our teeth and food and drinking and all the great things we need water for. But I wanted to dig a little bit deeper into actually understanding our environment. Now, when we're talking about native and adapted plants, we're talking about plants that are adapted to our hardiness zone. So those plants are going to come back even if we get down to 10 or 15 degrees or colder than that during our winter periods. We also want to make sure we're selecting plants that can grow in our soil type. Typically, those are heavy clays and higher pH soils. And so if the plants are adapted to our temperatures and our soil, then they're going to do a better job adapted to any of the other challenges that our climate can face. Now, rainfall is definitely one of those as well. If you're not familiar, North Central Texas, we get about 36 inches of rainfall. That's our average. We could get as low as 18. We could get as high as 60 something. If you live a little bit further west of the Metroplex, you get a little bit less water. If you live a little further east of the Metroplex, you typically get a little bit more water. And then also important is to think about our microenvironment. And this is especially true with irrigation systems, but how much sunlight or shade is on that part of your landscape or that irrigation zone? How are the buildings playing a role in either shading or protecting wind? Or are they playing any other role in terms of water running off the roof where that would affect moisture? Also pavement nearby. So it could be, sidewalks, driveways, and patios. And those structures actually collect the heat when it gets really hot during the day, and they can radiate some of that heat. And that actually increases the amount of water that is evaporated from those areas. So those hot spots or that have kind of that heat island effect, they actually require a tad more water. And so maybe that's a great spot to plant a plant that doesn't need as much water. And then our irrigation systems locally, depending on what type of irrigation component you have, what brand you have, the pressure in your system, all those different factors can affect if this part of the landscape is easily irrigated, or this one has challenges with irrigation. This one may stay a little bit wetter. This one may evaporate more and stay a little bit drier. So just think about that on your own property, the little changes in microclimate that could affect plant growth. Now, just kind of tying that together and where we get our water from, the water in our lakes is one of our most precious natural resources. And as we have this rapidly growing population with the Texas Water Development Board estimating up to 51 million people that will be in Texas by 2070, we need to figure out how to do more with less water to kind of help prepare for that population growth. In fact, if we look at this map of Texas, we actually see the red area. We may not, have in the city of Dallas or the city of Fort Worth or what city you are around the Metroplex. We may not be as big as Houston, but you can see that our population density is as dense or more dense than the greater Houston area here in north central Texas, with each one of these colors representing a fourth of the population. In fact, estimated over 7.6 million people now in north central Texas. So if you thought traffic was bad here this week, I don't know what it's going to be like here in the next 20 years. But, on the whole, really, that's the main thing, is that the population of Texas is growing. The water in our reservoirs, even with a couple new lakes coming on board that we're really excited about. Those two lines in this graph, the population growth and the demand of water, the availability of water, are kind of on two different tracks. And so how do we meet up that gap? Yeah, we can build new lakes, but the main thing that we can do is we can conserve water, or just make sure that the water we're using, that it goes further. It's more effective, especially in the landscape where so many of us use water. Now, we know that in terms of our climate, we're going to have to deal with drought, and thankfully we're not in drought right now. But as we kind of go through the history of recent history here in north central Texas, there are periods where we see less than 50% of our average rainfall. And those are times when we're going to have to supplementally irrigate our plants in order to keep them healthy so they can kind of last until we get our next rainfall event. Well, you may be asking, well, what can I actually do to kind of help these issues? Well, you can create an outdoor space that not only looks great, but can also increase your home's value. You can reduce water use where you can. We don't want to tell you don't use water at all. Just try and use it more effectively and more efficiently where you can. You can help curb stormwater runoff and pollutants. So sometimes if you overwater, you water at the right times, or even just when it rains, it takes pollutants down the sidewalk and the driveway. Those could be fertilizers or pet waste, or any kind of chemicals that you put to help grow your plants. We want to make sure that we know that those are ultimately going to end up in our creeks and our lakes where we get our water from. So we want to protect those resources. You can also, a lot of people are interested in providing food for people and pollinators and wildlife. We want to tell you, you can do that. You can water your plants and keep them healthy, but also protect the environment for all of our beneficial wildlife. And you can do this without breaking the bank. In fact, being efficient with your water is one of the best ways to actually lower your water bill in the summer if you've had issues. Now, if we look at the vegetation in north central Texas from a bird's eye view, the most dominant vegetation that we're going to see in most neighborhoods are going to be lawns. In fact, the fourth largest crop in the country is lawn. It's the largest irrigated crop, but the fourth largest just in terms of volume. And where corn, soybeans, and wheat, we're actually getting some food out of the deal. With lawns, unless you have a pet goat or maybe a pet rabbit or something, we're not really getting a lot of return on investment. So if we look at outdoor water use, and Patrick's going to dig into this in great detail, we can see that in our area, we really have a higher demand of gallons per day per household. So we have a higher water rate. People in north central Texas, use more water per person outdoors than a lot of other areas in the state. So it just means that we can do better. We've got some room to grow. In fact, unfortunately, homeowners, some of them tend to overwater landscapes as much as 2 to 3 times the amount needed. And that can be a problem for plant health. If we water too much and water at the wrong times, then we tend to have fungal problems, not only in our lawns, but also in our other plants. Some of our drought tolerant plants, if they get too much moisture, their roots will start to rot. So we want to make sure that we're delivering the right amount of water at the right time, but we don't want to just kind of apply it willy-nilly and think, oh, if a little bit goes a good way, then a lot's going to go even further. In fact, you could actually, decrease the health of your plant by over applying water. Now, the reason that plants need water is for photosynthesis. The water is going to be absorbed through the root zone. It travels to the stems, and it actually ends up in the leaves where the chloroplasts, or the green part that conduct photosynthesis, are really kind of the powerhouse of the plant. And so to complete all those processes, they really need water. And at the same time, when they're moving that water, they're actually taking nutrients from the plant root zones up through them. And if they don't have enough, then we see this in the summer. You may come home and see plants starting to wilt, and some of those processes could be effective. Now, naturally, plants are going to wilt during the heat of the day, and that is actually one of the ways that they're kind of avoiding the heat and the sunlight that is intense. And so that's not necessarily a problem. Minor wilting in the afternoon and the evening. And so it is good to check our plants in the morning for drought stress. And if the plants are still wilted in the morning, then that's a good time to go ahead and water. In fact, we love watering, earlier in the morning when it's cool outside, so it's more effective, but it also will help us as an indicator of if that plant is just responding to the heat of the day and wilting, which will recover, or if it's actually truly some type of drought stress if it's wilted in the morning. But again, too much water can cause a plant's root to rot, and we definitely don't want to go in that direction. In fact, a lot of times people may see symptoms that they think is too little water, but it's too much water, and the fine root hairs in the root zone have kind of died back. And because they have died back, they're not able to take up as much water. So we want to make sure we have plenty of oxygen, that the water and the ground don't stay too saturated. Now, the best way to deliver water is through the plant root zone. We don't want to really water the leaves or concentrate. We want to make sure we get it to the root zone. We don't want it to run off the roots. We want it to actually stay like a sponge where the roots can use it through those fine root hairs. In North Texas, our critical root zone, where most of the roots are actually growing, is 6 to 8 inches deep. So really, that's the whole goal of our irrigation system, is to deliver that water to about 6 to 8 inches deep, and then keep it in that zone until we get our next rainfall event. If the next rainfall event is 10 days or 2 weeks away, then for sure we're gonna need to run some type of irrigation system, whether that's your arm and a hose, or if that's actually an in-ground system. Now, the water in that soil is going to be lost in 3 different ways. It's going to either evaporate. So on hot, sunny days, it tends to evaporate more. If we apply compost and mulch, we're reducing that evaporation. It can also move kind of laterally through the soil, kind of moving downhill, or it can move down through the soil profile, kind of out of that 6 to 8 inches or that range of the root zone. So again, we're just kind of slow it down, deliver water to the root zone, keep that area moist during the periods where it's not raining, and then our plant should have plenty of water to thrive. Now, if it hasn't rained recently, especially during the heat of the summer, you may need to add water. Hand watering is a great way to do it, just supplementally. If you notice, hey, this plant needs a little, more water than some of the other established plants in the landscape, that's really the great first step. Also, maybe you want to you use your hose in sprinklers, whether those are oscillating sprinklers or impact sprinklers, setting that up, making sure you're not running water off the landscape, delivering it to your plants, or turning on that in-ground system with your pop-up heads or drip irrigation that Patrick will talk a lot more about. But how much water do plants actually really need? Established trees, shrubs, and adapted perennials need a whole lot less water than you might think. And this is just kind of a silly little picture here, but you don't want to water your landscape to where it's flooded. You just really, probably want to put about a half an inch at a time during those periods where we're not getting rainfall, so that we can allow soil moisture provide that available water for our plants. A lot of times people will ask, you know, how much do I water this plant? How much do I water this plant? I understand that it can really get confusing just based on, you know, what amount of water plant actually needs. But there are some factors I want to talk a little bit about, or kind of we'll just dip our toes in, that are called the slide plant factors, right? Rather, and you'll notice this is kind of a water slide here with a bunch of plants around it that is kind of just a play on that acronym. But it stands for Simplified Landscape Irrigation Demand Estimate. It's funny they start with simplified and then they do a drawn out acronym, but it is, you know, slide. It kind of, you think about, okay, that makes sense. But it's really just numbers that help estimate the water demand of an established plant. Now, new plants are going to require a little bit more water for the first month or two that they're in the ground, and then typically you taper off that water. But what we're talking about is what are the demands, you know, comparing each kind of plant, group of plants together to see, well, how does turf grass and, you know, water needs compared to trees, compared to vegetables, compared to, you know, desert type plants. But it's really just based on the type of the plant's ability to use water efficiently. Patrick will talk more about this in Vapo Transpiration, but just, you know, how efficiently plants use water as they're moving them and transpiring them through their leaves. Again, the water's taken up through the roots and eventually it comes out through the pores of the stomata and the plant leaves. And we dig that deeper in some of our other programs. But just kind of the baseline, if we use those slide numbers or those slide factors, our home vegetable crops are going to require kind of the most amount of water. So you can kind of understand many of those plants are herbaceous and they're kind of moisture filled and they're not as kind of drought tolerant as maybe some of our other established native or adapted plants that have really deep root systems. We can definitely save water in the vegetable garden. We can mulch and we can add compost and use drip irrigation and make sure the water we do deliver isn't as much. But typically those vegetables are just gonna, you know, in hot, dry weather, they're gonna need a little bit more water to stay healthy. That's the same with home fruit crops. So if you're growing peaches or, you know, pears or plums, things like that, some of them can be more water efficient, but generally they're at kind of that 0.8 zone. So this is just showing, comparing them. Vegetable crops use a little bit more water. Home fruit crops use a little bit less than that. Our turf grass lawns, so any of our warm season lawns that we can grow in north central Texas, so Bermuda, Zoysia, St. Augustine, Buffalo, those are about a 0.6 plant factor. So you can see they're using significantly less water than our fruit crops or vegetable crops. Then mixed planting. So you may have a bed that doesn't have just one type of plant, right? It may have maybe you have some herbs in that garden, or maybe you have some perennial flowers, maybe you have some shrubs or some trees. Well, if you have shrubs and trees and perennials all in the same bed, then you're really trying to deliver water to the one that requires the most. So if you look at that bed and 90% of the plants are kind of medium water users, but you have a couple that use a little bit more water, well, you want to kind of focus on those, whether you're actually hand watering them kind of supplementally, or maybe they're in a lower area and they catch some of the runoff. But mixed plantings, you're really just kind of focusing on delivering the water to the weakest link, if you will. Now, one way around that we'll talk about is hydrozoning, which is you probably don't want to put a high water using plant in a bed or zone where you have mostly drought tolerant plants, because you're probably going to be overwatering the drought tolerant plants and underwatering the higher water using plants. So if you do have higher water using plants, what we don't really recommend, maybe you put them in a pot or a container, maybe you put them in another spot in the landscape that's kind of lower and more shaded, that you can just run that zone maybe just a little bit longer, but the 90% of your landscape, you're actually really planting more plants that are adapted, like our herbaceous perennial plants. We group those in a plant factor of 0.5. Trees, shrubs, vines, and ground covers have a plant factor of about 0.5. Our annual flowers and bedding plants, again, because those tend to be smaller plants that probably are not as adapted to Texas, they tend to have a higher water demand. Also, because we plant them more frequently, they don't tend to have as large of a root zone. A plant with a deeper, more established, vibrant, healthy root system just has more surface area to go out there in the root zone and grab more moisture if moisture is scarce. So smaller plants tend to struggle with that. Bigger plants with great healthy root zones, amended with compost and mulch, tend to do a better job of that. So we kind of steer people clear of planting too many annuals. If you are going to plant annuals, try and plant the drought tolerant ones that do better in our climate. And speaking of drought tolerant plants, our desert adapted plants like the yuccas and the hesperales we see here, those have a plant factor of 0.3. So in fact, once they're established, they're probably not going to require little, if any, supplemental water unless we run into a severe drought. So just think about that when you're grouping your plants together. Make sure that you're kind of putting them together by close water needs, if they're kind of adjacent. That's okay, but you don't want to oversaturate your desert plants, and you don't want to underwater kind of your higher water using plants. And if at all possible, we'd really just like to focus on low to medium water plants as much as we can, because that's going to be more efficient with our water resources, and the plants are just going to be healthier, right? You don't want to have a landscape full of plants that need to be babied all the time, or that just creates a lot more work, a lot more maintenance, a lot more headaches, because you're probably not going to be successful if you're trying to grow a landscape full of hydrangeas and azaleas and these plants that aren't adapted to our area. Now, other things to consider: heat and wind. Typically, the west side of our house or the south side of our house tends to be a little bit hotter. Also, because we get a lot of our winds coming from the south, or prominent winds kind of the south and the southwest. That could be a factor where on windy days, there's more evaporation and Vapo Transpiration happening around the plants. And so that water is being lost. So, on really windy days, maybe you want to make sure that you're watering a little bit more, or that we're mulching and composting those windy areas using drip irrigation, everything we can that's efficient, so those plants have plenty of water. Buildings and structures nearby, they affect sunlight. They could also block the wind, but they play a role on how much a landscape irrigation zone actually really needs. The sunlight and the orientation I mentioned. But yeah, typically the east side of your home is going to be cooler and have more gentle sunlight. And on the shady spots, they probably don't need as much water as the plants that are on kind of the south and the southwest side. So you may have parts of your landscape that are a little bit hot spot. Really, in my landscape, that's where I put my yuccas and my hesperalos and cacti and pretty like blooming plants like Blackfoot daisy, any of those like Texas sage that really are beautiful and lush and vibrant. They just they don't like a lot of water, and so I put them in a spot where they don't need a lot of water, and they're not going to get as much water. Compacted soils also play a role. So if you have an area that has been just compacted with a lot of foot traffic and kids and dogs, sometimes that can affect how much water actually infiltrates the soil and how much you have to irrigate a turf grass area. So maybe you need to aerate that or apply compost to make sure that the water actually is being effective. Slope soils also play a role. So I have parts of my landscape that have actually a fairly steep slope. Again, that's where I like to put my plants that need good drainage. You always hear a plant, oh, this one has to have good drainage, like the Blackfoot daisy or the Texas sage or yuccas, what have you. Well, if they're on a slope, it's harder for the water to actually infiltrate into the soil. The water kind of wants to run off when we get a lot of rainfall. That's great for those plants. It could be a challenge for plants that are kind of the medium to high water using level, though. And so there are different ways that we can irrigate. We'll talk about that later, but one is called the cycle and soak method of irrigation. But basically, instead of watering with one long run time, we're breaking it up into multiple run times with periods of pause in between. So the top layer of the water can kind of get saturated or just, moist. If we run it for 3 minutes, then we stop, and then we run it for 5 minutes, and the water can go deeper into the soil profile, and then another 5 minutes, and the water can go deeper than that. And really, that's the best way to irrigate it, with compacted soils or slopes or anywhere that has heavy clays, where if you're putting out the water, you start to see in the first couple of minutes it just runs off the landscape. Well, that water is not being affected. But Patrick's going to dig into that in a lot more detail. I also mentioned hardscape again, just kind of as we're wrapping this up. The hardscape that is our pathways and our patios, or anything that can heat up, those tend to be hot spots and may need a little bit more water. Or again, those are great areas near the concrete, the driveway, the patios, to plant those drought tolerant plants as well. So really, hydrozoning is just pulling this all together, grouping plants by their similar requirements. So plants that like certain soil type. Again, those drought tolerant plants, maybe you're amending more compost, or a compost sand kind of expanded shale mix into there to make sure they have better drainage. Or there's plants that do better in heavy clay soils. Maybe you're grouping those into the areas of your landscape that have more heavy clays. Those that require full sun, you put with full sun. Those that require full shade, you put with full shade. And those on different irrigation zones, you can put a different run sign to make sure you're kind of tailoring the irrigation to meet their needs. So turf grass should be separately put on its zone because it has different water requirements. Annual color, those annuals, maybe you're hand watering those to make sure that they're getting extra water they need during the summer months. Herbaceous perennials, putting them together, those are pretty much bulletproof. Once they're established, there's very few times in the year that you would actually need to irrigate those. We tend to have rainfall events that are well timed out, in the spring and the fall and the summer months, probably a little bit of supplemental irrigation, but choosing the right plants goes a long way at reducing our water needs. And then those trees, shrubs, and woody perennials, a lot of times we put those on separate zones, or because they have similar water needs, we can mix those with our native and adapted herbaceous perennials. But that's really all hydrozoning is. It's just trying to deliver the right amount of water to the right plants and grouping those together by their water needs. Now, we talked about we get our municipal water from our cities, from our water providers, that is coming from our lakes or reservoirs. But if you find yourself using too much municipal water and you'd like to reduce your water bill and really just deliver the healthiest water, the best quality of water to plants, rainwater harvesting is something to branch out into. We teach classes on rain barrels as well as larger cisterns. But salt-free, it's chlorine-free. You don't have to abide by the city's watering guidelines. If you're using your rainwater, you could water your vegetable garden, or you could water, your annual plants that need a little bit more water. Even if it's not on your watering day, you have kind of your little system there that's great for supplemental water. You may also want to look into gray water harvesting. One way you can do that is just with your AC condensate, the moisture coming off your air conditioner. If you had maybe a fruit tree that required a little bit more water, or maybe it's an area that has a slope where it drains off and there's a little bit higher water using plant, run the AC condensate there. And so it's actually using the water that is created by running your air conditioner. And that's another way just to kind of branch out and be more efficient with our water. Now, really, I wanted to follow up talking about the main purpose of an irrigation system, which is to support the health of the landscape by delivering supplemental water where rainfall is minimal. If it's raining outside, you don't need to run your irrigation system. Really, if it's rained 2 or 3 days ago, you don't need to run your irrigation system. Or if rain is in the forecast, you don't need to run your irrigation system. Let Mother Nature do the work. Our soils can only hold so much water. So if you're putting out too much too fast, then it's just going down the storm drain and going down the creek, and something you're paying for, and not an efficient use of a natural resource. So it really just comes down to better water management. If it's rain is in the forecast, or it's just rain, turn your water off, or just avoid watering for that period and let Mother Nature do the work. Now, during establishment of new plants we talked about, again, you may need to hand water. You may need to run a system a little bit more. Maybe if you installed turf grass or you just planted a new tree. But periodically, you're going to need to maintain and repair the system to make sure that the water is actually going where it's supposed to the root zone. And then, as those plants mature and their root zones grow and establish, again, they're going to get to reach out and go and tap into that moisture lower in the soil profile and kind of laterally. And that's the greatest thing about planting native and adapted plants is once they're established, they're kind of taking the work out of it. Patrick and I joke that we're lazy gardeners. If you choose the right plants from the get-go, and once you get them through that establishment, then watering is, maybe something that you're doing, 10 times a year for our native perennials and shrubs and trees, if that much. So which is really nice. I wanted to talk about a little tool that I find helpful. And I think if you were trying to be more water efficient in your landscape and you just want to drive it home and actually run the numbers yourself, it's called the EPA's water budget tool. And if you just type that into your favorite browser, EPA water budget tool, it pops up. You can download a little Excel spreadsheet, but it is based on the amount of area you have on each plant. So we talked about those slide plant factors. Well, how many desert like plants do you have, and or xeric plants, or how much turf grass area do you have in square footage, or how much vegetable garden you have in square footage? What area do you have that's patio or mulch? And you can kind of mix that around and reduce the amount of water that you're actually using on your landscape by maybe reducing turf grass area and planting those adapted perennials. Or you could actually add on a 55-gallon drum or a larger 1,000-gallon cistern, and you can help calculate the landscape water needs and then your available water by using this tool. It's got some fun little tips there to kind of play around with. It looks complicated, but it's really not. It kind of calculates ET and everything for you. You can type in your irrigation type and your distribution uniformity and all that to just figure out how you can create water savings where you can. Now, you may also consider getting rid of some of your lawn. Typically, lawns are going to take the most water, and Patrick will dig into that in more detail. And so if we can establish those native and adaptive perennials, then you're not going to have to run your irrigation system very often, and you'll actually reduce your maintenance in your landscape. So what we like to think of at Rooted In is our ideal landscape is about a third turf grass. That's plenty to kick a soccer ball. That's plenty to go out and talk to your neighbors. About a third perennial plants. So we talked about those trees and shrubs and flowers that are vibrant and just beautiful. It's not just cacti and yucca. There's so many plants that grow great in our area. And then about a third pervious hardscape. So we talk about hardscape. If we plant pervious or not plant, but put in the ground or on the ground pervious hardscape, like pathways and patios, it could be like arroyos or dry riverbeds that actually infiltrate that water instead of running it off like when a raindrop hits the sidewalk or the concrete. Then that water can slow down and sink into our soil. And then all the plants around those pathways, if it's gravel or flagstone or pavestone, then they can take advantage of that moisture. So it just makes sense to be greedy with those water drops. When they fall, we want to sink them into the soil so our plants' root zones can use them. So again, we like to hit home. If we plant those native and adapted plants, they're going to be more drought tolerant, and typically they're going to use less water, less fertilizers, and less pesticides. And my colleague, Patrick Dickinson, is going to talk more about that coming up, but I want to go ahead and pass it off to him. And again, thank you all for joining us.
Thanks, Daniel. Well, we're out here doing an irrigation check on an irrigation system. We found a broken sprinkler head, so I'm going to flag it as a reminder to get it fixed. So keep some of these irrigation flags on hand. You can get them at most hardware stores. So I'm going to put that as a reminder. And now let's head over here to this table, and we're going to talk about some irrigation parts to help you out with some of the terminology and all the different components of your irrigation system. So we've got this nice little table set up with many of the different parts and components. But let's start back at where your irrigation starts. From your city meter, typically out at the curb or at the parkway of your house, is a separate box. And it's usually a rectangle box. And cleverly, it says irrigation valve on it. And that's what's called your backflow or double check. That's where the water comes into your irrigation system. Your whole irrigation system is operated by water pressure. So when sprinkler heads pop up, when water comes out of your drip, it's all water pressure. The electricity is really from the controller and then to the solenoid of your valves, and that's where it stops. So there's no other electricity involved with this. So when we get from the city meter, the water comes in what's called your main line. So if we look at one of your irrigation meters, so one of the things you have to look for in your irrigation system is typically boxes that look like this. They have the round lid on them. It says irrigation control valve on it. You should have one of these that has a valve like this on the inside for every zone that you have on your sprinkler system. So this is a larger 1-inch valve, just showing you for demonstration. Most of your valves will be anywhere from 3/4 inch and sometimes down to 1/2 inch, but most of the times your zone valves will be about 3/4 of an inch. So from that valve, what happens is, let's say this is your main line coming from that city water. It comes into your valve here. So that's what we call your main line. And what that means is there's always water pressure in this pipe. It's called static water pressure. So we don't want to just go cutting into this pipe because water comes shooting out. From the valve going back, this is the part if you find some water bubbling up out of the ground or something like that, we do request you find a licensed irrigator. There are ones that are going to be more well-versed on turning off the water back at your double check to cut this pipe and repair it. Now, if you have done this before, that's called a quick fix. We encourage you to make sure all your valve and pipes are repaired and not leaking. So don't ever let it go for too long or continue to use it for too long without getting it repaired. Now, what happens is this is where that electricity stops, like I told you about. The top of your valve, this is called the solenoid. I call it kind of the brains of your valve. Your irrigation controller sends a signal through these wires that says open and close. When it opens, the water, that static water pressure coming from your main line, then goes gushing through this valve to the other pipe on the other side, which is then called your lateral line. Your lateral lines are where all of your sprinkler heads, your drip, everything is attached to. So when that valve opens up and all that water pressure goes gushing through there, that's what tells those sprinkler heads to pop up, the water come out of your drip, or even on rotor sprinkler heads. So remember, always keep these valve boxes exposed. I know a lot of people say they really hate the look of them, but they've been really nice to create green ones to go in your grass and even brown ones to go in your flower beds to match the mulch. But you always want to know where these are for the valves, because if one of these valves go out and you do have to hire a licensed irrigator at an average rate of $100 to $125 an hour to locate this valve, that's going to be a little bit more money than you're probably wanting to spend. But keeping it always exposed makes it more accessible and easy to get to for repairs. Now, you probably noticed this other piece hanging off the backside of this valve right here. This piece right here is a Y filter or strainer. So on the inside of it, there's actually a strainer or a filter. And what this does is our municipal water, we classify as hard water. So it's got a lot of calcium and lime and salt in it. This helps filter out some of those components in your water so that it doesn't clog up your irrigation. Kind of like your sprinkler heads, or not your sprinkler heads, your shower heads, your kitchen faucets might have that white crusty kind of buildup on there, or even at the bottom of some of your potted plants. This helps strain out some of that. Now, you don't get that buildup if you do things like rainwater harvesting. The rainwater doesn't have that lime calcium buildup in there. Now, it also is a pressure reducer. Now, you're probably wondering, why would we need to reduce pressure? Now, you can determine the pressure on your home by doing a PSI valve on your outside faucet of your home. You screw this onto the outside faucet, open up that faucet all the way, and it's going to tell you your pressure. The average pressure for a home can be anywhere from 35 to 60 PSI. Now, we have some communities where that PSI can be as much as 100 PSI. And that's where you get typically that fogging that comes out of your sprinkler heads, where it's nice during a hot summer day, but it's not giving you any efficiency in watering your plants. So sometimes we have to slow that water down to a pressure that's more recommended to use our irrigation sprinkler heads and drip irrigation, especially because drip runs off of about 15 to 25 PSI. Our other nozzles work well off of 35 to 60 PSI, but it's still a good opportunity to slow down the water at the valve. Now, yes, we can also put a pressure reducer all the way back at your backflow from the city meter, And that definitely does require a licensed irrigator. But this is something you can add yourself, because the pressure reducer does go at the side of the valve where there is no static pressure. So there's no water running through this unless this valve opens up. So this slows down the water. It helps filter that water before it then goes into the lateral line. So many different valves. This one right here is a large valve, but it does show you the inside of the valve. And I can turn this where you can see how it opens up, and I can actually push this valve that's actually pushes this up, and that's where the water pressure goes through. So this is where our water pressure comes in here. And then when the valve opens up and this piece lifts up, the water pressure then goes gushing through here out into the lateral line in your sprinkler system. So that's how the valve works. And again, this is the solenoid that says open and close, with the wire from your irrigation controller. So that's the basics of the valves in your irrigation system. Just keep in mind the things of look inside those valve boxes from time to time so that you don't see water bubbling up and accumulating on the inside. That could mean you have a leak around the valve or even down the pipe somewhere that's traveling into the valve box. But always a good idea to open these up and check these from time to time to make sure everything's going all right. Wires aren't getting cut or chewed on, and that everything's going to operate properly for you. And that's part of your irrigation checks, is turning on those zones, kind of walking through, keep those irrigation flags on hand so you can check those as well. Now, once we get through the lateral line coming out to the one side of your valve, then we have to get into what I like to call your delivery system. Your delivery system can be anything from large rotor heads, pop-up sprinkler heads, or even drip tubing. Now, drip tubing is, in the state of Texas, required in all parkways and medians. 48 inches or less has to be drip irrigation. Some cities have taken that larger to 60 inches. And basically what that means is that parkway on the other side of your sidewalk, between your sidewalk and street, we don't want spray irrigation there, because we do our best with nozzles that are designed for parkways and medians, because some of y'all may still have older systems that have spray in there, but it still oversprays, causes a lot of runoff, waters the concrete. We don't have to water concrete to watch it grow. It's growing all around us no matter what, but we don't want to be spraying that concrete. So drip irrigation works really well. There is subsurface drip that even grows underneath turf grasses, but this is your primary delivery system. And so let's go over each one of these so you understand the components and how each one of them operates. So I like to start with the rotor sprinkler head. The rotor sprinkler head typically comes with this universal key like you see right here. The key on top of there's two ends to the key. The first one that has the two little sides of it goes in the part that's shaped like it. This determines the radius or the pattern of the sprinkler head. I can then take that out and use the metal piece to put in where it says the plus and minus, and that determines the throw. So those are two terminologies that you need to understand. The throw determines how far the sprinkler head's going to spray, and with adjustable heads like this, you can adjust that. The pattern is the basic, the geometry you thought you'd never use again: 90 degrees, 180, 270, 360. So kind of like the corner of a sidewalk in a driveway, that's 90 degrees. So that helps you adjust the pattern. Most rotors are adjustable from 270 all the way down to about 45 degrees. And then you buy the spray head based on what's called head-to-head coverage. So your rotors, and I'll talk more about this with pop-ups as well, you need to measure from one sprinkler head to the next. Literally take your tape measure outside and measure from one sprinkler head to the next. And if they are 10 feet apart, then you need to buy a rotor or a nozzle that allows you to spray a 10-foot radius. Remember, we're measuring the half distance of a circle. So you need to buy that 10-foot radius. You want your sprinkler heads kind of having a water fight with each other. And the reason for that is, going back to what I said about our water being hard water, is over time, these plastic components with that hard water can wear down a little bit. Not that they still can't function efficiently, but instead of them spraying all the way from head to head, they can start spraying less, not as far as they used to. And with head-to-head coverage, it ensures that the overlapping, you don't get any dry spots, and you still get that nice coverage in your irrigation or in your landscape. So that's the importance of head-to-head coverage. So remember that. Measuring your sprinkler heads, that's something you're going to want to do if you are looking to replace some of your sprinkler heads. Now, to show you some of the components of a rotor sprinkler head, This is a great close-up right here that shows you how the key goes inside the sprinkler head so that it can be adjusted and turning the inside components. You see how the sprinkler head's turning? That determines our pattern. And when you look on the inside, you can see as I turn the sprinkler head, well, is my key in there? This is great about live. You can hear that components turning, and that's the pattern, how it's changing the pattern. And you can see inside, the inside of your sprinkler heads, they're all spring loaded. They're all spring driven. So when the water pressure comes through the pipe at the base of it, it pushes this sprinkler head up and out of the ground. And that's where you then start seeing the spraying. And you can really see all those components on rotor heads and the engineering that really goes into those sprinkler heads. So that's the rotor sprinkler head. These are the ones that you see with the big stream. Typically you see on big landscapes or sports fields, golf courses, things like that. Now let's go to the most common type of sprinkler head, which we see in residential, and that's the pop-up sprinkler head. Now the pop-up sprinkler head is just like it says, it pops up out of the ground. And like the rotor head, you can see on the inside of this one, it's just spring driven. So the water pressure comes through here to the bottom and it then pushes the sprinkler head up out of the ground. This one's a lot more simple engineering than the rotor head. You can see how just a very simple spring on the inside. And that's what I want to show you is that when you're adjusting pop-up sprinkler heads or even rotor sprinkler heads, you're going to have to do that while the sprinkler system is running. I hope many of y'all aren't coming to this program to learn how to adjust sprinklers without getting wet. We just got wet checking this sprinkler system and finding some of the problems. But what that means is when your sprinkler head pops up out of the ground and you notice that it's spraying some concrete and not the grass, you need to take a hold of this riser and you turn it. Now listen to it. It sounds awful. You're not doing anything wrong to the sprinkler head. That is just all those components on the inside turning on the inside plastic shell. That's all you're hearing. But it's important for you to turn this and get it to spray exactly where it needs to spray. Now, there are adjustable nozzles. I'm going to show you those here in just a second, that you can determine the pattern of your pop-up spray head and even the throw to a certain degree with pop-up sprinkler heads. But this is the most common. And to kind of show you how it's set up, your sprinkler heads can be anywhere from about 6 to 8 inches below ground. And this is typically what it looks like when it's in the ground. So let me screw these on so I can show you this. So this would be your soil level right here. So kind of what you're looking at the soil level. Your sprinkler head is attached to a riser in the ground. That riser is then attached to what's called a T on the inside that's then attached to your lateral lines, if you remember what those are, where the water comes gushing through. And this is where the water comes through and pops up into your sprinkler head from here. Now, this is very important with your irrigation checks because there are 4 points of threading on a sprinkler head that you can adjust yourself. And this is where we see a lot of the leaks and the inefficiencies. So your nozzle, actually, that's just a cap on this one. So your nozzle looks something like this. So this nozzle is what determines your pattern and the throw of your pop-up sprinkler head when it sprays out of the ground. And it even has this little filter at the bottom to help filter out some things that can get in your pipes, especially if you do any adjustments. You could get some debris in there. This threads onto the top of your sprinkler head like this. And I love showing you this part because there's these reverse pliers like you see right here that a lot of the brands sell that go on sprinkler heads to keep them from popping back down. This is a great, about $10 tool for you to keep, for you to make adjustments in your own sprinkler system. They're reverse pliers, but the great thing about it is, let's say I'm changing out my nozzles, and I accidentally let go of it. Well, if you don't have these pliers, you then have to dig in the ground, unscrew your entire sprinkler head to push that riser back up. But these reverse pliers allow me to get in there and pull the riser right back up, just like that. It's that simple. So you don't have to do any digging to change a nozzle when you're doing something like this. So over time with vibration, foot traffic, vehicles running over sprinkler heads, these threaded parts can come loose, just like anything else can come loose, like a jar lid or something like that. So they might just need to be tightened down. So my nozzle, I might need to tighten it down if I see water spraying out from the side of it. The cap of my sprinkler head also comes undone, and you're going to see the spring on the inside. That cap, these actually come loose a lot easier than other things do. These just need to be tightened back down. Vibration over time from water pressure can loosen them up. Your sprinkler head is threaded onto the riser, and then the riser is threaded into the pipe at the bottom. These are all quick check fixes that you can do yourself by just tightening everything back down. It really is as simple as that. And a lot of people say, well, what about the irrigators? Can't they come out and do it? Yes, they can do it. But remember, you're paying for them to come out. And licensed irrigators really don't care to do a lot of things like this because it takes them time to drive to you, make the repair, and then leave and go to the next job. Just like a plumber coming out to change like a flap or something in your toilet that you could do yourself. They're looking to work with you on your valves and other big things that you really do need the help with. This right here, you can do yourself. Now you'll notice the riser. Now this is a special type of riser that we wanted to show you. And the great thing about this riser is if you've ever changed a sprinkler head or needed to raise a sprinkler head up in your landscape, you can make multiple trips to the irrigation plumbing house to buy different length risers. And it can be quite annoying to do that. You see the different divisions on this riser. This allows you to take this home and cut to the length that you need and not have to go back and forth. And the great thing about it is they're really cheap, like $1.50 to purchase these. And so I can come in here and I can actually just cut this division off and determine where that sprinkler head needs to go. It really is that easy. So that's the makeup of your pop-up sprinkler head. And remember the nozzle at the top. Now, another feature about the nozzle at the top that I want to show you is keeping a little flathead screwdriver handy. And I don't see my flathead screwdriver, but what I want you to look at is the little screw at the very top of your nozzle. That little bitty screw, a lot of people think that's what holds that nozzle together, when in fact, that little screw actually allows you to adjust the throw of pop-up sprinkler heads within about a foot. Now, unlike the rotors, we don't make massive adjustments to that. So putting that little flathead screwdriver in there, when I loosen that screw, it allows me to increase the throw of my spray by about a foot. If I tighten it down, it reduces it about a foot. And the reason that's good is because some of y'all may go out there and measure your sprinkler heads and find out that you need 9-foot throw, like for your head-to-head coverage. Well, they don't sell 9-foot nozzles. They sell 8-foot, 10-foot, 12-foot. And so you could buy the 10-foot nozzle and you could tighten that screw down to pull it back 1 foot. And that's how you can make easy adjustments from there. So that's the components of a pop-up sprinkler head. So now let's talk a little bit about drip irrigation. Drip irrigation can be a lot of fun to kind of play around with. There's a lot of different pieces and parts and fittings that put the different drip tubings together. This is all 1/2-inch drip that I have right here. This is 1/4-inch drip tubing, which I like to call kind of spaghetti tubing. It's a lot smaller, and there are even parts and components for it as well to help piece it all together. But this can be a lot of fun to kind of think through. If any of y'all ever played with those Link or Connect type toys when you were kids, it's kind of the same principles. And I almost wonder if somebody thought of it from those types of toys when we were kids. Drip is the most efficient form of irrigation that we can teach you, short of just not irrigating at all. It's 90% efficient. It gets covered up by mulch, out of sight, out of mind. You don't have to look at it. You don't have to worry about it. And it puts water where the water needs to go, at the root of the plant. We ask this a lot in our seminars. We ask people, do the leaves of plants actually need water? And the answer is no. The roots of the plants need water. So spraying irrigation can be efficient in some instances, whereas drip irrigation is more efficient, especially putting the water back at the roots of the plant. Because some of y'all in your landscapes may have risers. And we're talking about those risers that have the same nozzles that your pop-up sprinkler heads have. And they start growing with the shrubs because you have to spray over the shrubs to get to the plants in front of them. That is the perfect opportunity to take that water back down to the ground, get rid of those risers, and convert to drip irrigation. And it is very easy to do. And I'm going to show you a part that you can purchase to do yourself. This part. Now, this is not a sprinkler head. This is a drip conversion adapter. This replaces your sprinkler head. So what you would do in your system is you would go through and remove a pop-up sprinkler head where you're wanting to change to drip. We will put the conversion adapter in its place. And the great thing about these conversion adapters is if I open up to show you what's inside, you might recognize this part if I can get it out. Again, great things about live TV. It has this filter strainer on the inside. So your conversion adapter is no longer, it's not a sprinkler head anymore. It has the filter on the inside. The top part of the conversion adapter is the pressure reducer. Remember I said drip runs off of about 15 to 25 PSI, so we have to really slow the water down. This conversion adapter does just that at the top of this, what used to be your sprinkler head. I don't think I got the filter in there right. There we go. And then it screws on like that. Now from that top piece, we can put an adapter like this on the top because it already comes threaded. I screw that on, and from there is where I can attach my drip tubing to run through all my flower beds. Because remember, this is at soil level right here. So now all my drip tubing is running directly off of this. Now what this means is if you convert a flower bed to drip irrigation, is you have to convert the entire bed to drip, that entire zone. You cannot mix drip and spray irrigation together because one of them goes off gallons per minute and one of them goes off gallons per hour. So we do have to run our drip irrigation considerably longer than we do our spray irrigation, but it's still efficient because it's putting out like 0.6 gallons of water per hour at each emitter, whereas each nozzle of our spray head puts out a lot more water. So I can run the drip directly off of there. You don't need to change every sprinkler head. Let's say you're changing one or converting one flower bed and you have 5 spray heads in that bed. You may only need 1 or maybe 2 conversion adapters, which means you can cap off all your other sprinkler heads in that system and you end up with only 2 of these to run all your drip tubing off of. So again, no more spraying windows or sidewalks or your cars. All the water's gone back down to where it needs to go at the soil and at the root of the plant. It really is as simple as that. I can't express enough how simple this conversion adapter has made things for converting to drip in our irrigation systems. So now, drip tubing, unlike our pop-up spray heads, the great thing about pop-up spray heads is all your nozzles that you buy, if you change them out, they're universal. So if you have a Rainbird sprinkler head, you can use a Hunter nozzle if it's more cost-effective for you, and you can do Netafim, whatever. It doesn't matter which brand you use. With drip tubing, as of right now, what drip tubing you buy, you have to buy the fittings that go with that drip tubing. So right here we have Netafim drip tubing. We have to use the Netafim fittings because that's the only fitting that will fit in this drip tubing. If we don't use the right fittings, what happens is when we turn on the water, all your tubing can start blowing apart and coming apart. So as of right now, we recommend that you do use all the brands fittings for the tubing that you buy. So just make sure you're doing brand to brand, brand specific for your drip tubing. Then for drip tubing, you're going to keep all these parts. So you got elbows, you've got tees, all these little fittings, and there's even drip cutters. Now, what's great about these drip cutters, and these are fancy, nice little blacked out cutters, is it cuts through the drip tubing just like a pair of scissors, just like that. And the end right here that kind of looks like a hook, it allows you to go into the end of the drip tubing and kind of widen it out and kind of loosen it up. So then you can put your fitting in a lot easier. Now, these are called Barbed Tees is what this type of fitting is called. And so these little barbed fittings, what they do is, I don't know if you remember the old kind of Chinese fingers, you put 2 fingers in and if you keep pulling, they come out. Same thing works with this. These Barbed Tees keep the fitting in place in the drip tubing. I would recommend that you wear gloves when you do this part because your hands can get a little raw, kind of messing with this fitting, but you're really going to just kind of work it in, kind of muscle it in to where it gets over the 2 Barbed Tees, and that fitting is now in place in that drip tubing. That's as simple as it is. Now, you're not going to need a whole lot of these fittings, especially for large beds, because you can loop your drip tubing back around. And the other thing you have to remember is, so this is called inline drip tubing. So inline means that it already has the emitters spaced out for you in the tubing. In this case, this tubing is at 12-inch spacing. So each one of these emitters and each line are 12 inches apart. Well, depending on what size spacing you buy on your drip tubing determines how far apart your rows should be. So if I buy 12-inch spaced emitters, then each row of my drip tubing needs to be 12 inches apart. If I buy 18 foot, they need to be 18 inches. Then I have to buy 18 or space them out 18 inches apart. It's as simple as that. There's no real math to that otherwise. You run this through all your flower beds, especially getting around the root zones of all your plants. And you have to do what's called a loop system when you do this. And we teach a really great online class for that to show you how to convert to drip irrigation. What that means is when you lay out your inline drip tubing, that tubing needs to come back in and loop back into itself at some point. We can't just cap off the end. That's because this tubing is designed to have pressure that builds up in the tubing. So each one of these little emitters is putting out the same amount of water when it's irrigating in your landscape. So those are some of the fun toys and components that you can put for drip tubing. The other thing you can do, if you're like some of the people that have trouble letting go of seeing the water spraying in their landscape, you can purchase little indicator heads like this. And what this does is there's a little fitting that attaches to the drip tubing. And when you turn on that drip tubing, this little guy pops up. So it tells you your drip tubing is running. So you don't have to be digging around and looking for water coming out of there. So it just pops up. It tells you that it's running and you're good to go. It's a little indicator head that you can put in your landscape. There's even some that have a little flag that kind of pops up. It's not required. You don't have to have this. Just some people want to make sure that things are operating. Part of your irrigation checks, you can go around and make sure these are popping up and that your drip tubing is actually operating and popping up. All right. So now I want to talk a little bit going to the actual controller of your irrigation system. This is a newer version of an irrigation controller. The one thing I want to point out to people is if your irrigation controller doesn't allow you to have multiple programs, like program A, B, C, and D, and if your controller does not allow you to attach a rain and freeze sensor to your controller, it's time for a new controller. The reason for that is because your irrigation controller acts like an alarm clock. It allows you to run multiple programs for like a cycle and soak, running through multiple cycles to reduce or eliminate runoff in your system. But also your rain and freeze sensor turns off your controller at about 38 degrees. So you don't have freezing irrigation going everywhere. It also turns it off at about 3/8 of an inch of rainfall. So you're not that neighbor that's irrigating their landscape in the rainfall outside. But it might be time for you to upgrade your irrigation controller. The other great thing, what I've done even on my system, is I've upgraded to a controller that allows me to operate from my cell phone. So there's no back and forth to my controller. In fact, I don't remember the last time I actually went to my controller. I can turn off my controller. I can run it manually, run through my system, all from the luxury of my cell phone. And I think a lot of y'all that are tech savvy will really enjoy that and like that, have that luxury of operating from your phone, because I think a lot of people are doing that nowadays. Okay, so the other thing that I wanted to point out is all the different components for those people that they like to call hose draggers that still irrigate their landscape the old-fashioned way, as I like to say. In a lot of ways, I think we were more efficient then because we had eyes on the water. We knew where we wanted it to go, where we didn't want it to go, and we certainly didn't want it running down the driveway because we really saw that as our money running down the driveway. There are many different types still offered today at most hardware stores of different sprinklers that attach to the end of a water hose. The one tip that I will tell you about these is get some of these sprinklers like you see here that put out really big drops of water. You don't want anything that does a fine mist. The bigger drops of water are heavier, so they're going to fall, and you're going to be more efficient with spraying in your irrigation system. And then always at the end of your water hose, have some type of nozzle, even adjustable, that has different settings on it for you to be able to hand water plants. But don't allow water just to constantly run out of your water hose. You just don't realize the pressure that's coming out of your water hose is the same pressure coming out of your kitchen faucet. And you probably wouldn't leave your kitchen faucet just running for minutes, if not an hour on end. So don't leave your water hose running like that, because that water coming out of your water hose costs the same as the water coming out of your kitchen faucet. So just remember big drops of water. Some of the newer technologies that we've even gone to within the irrigation system for those big drops of water are more improved nozzles like this one that's called a multi-stream rotor nozzle. This multi-stream rotor nozzle, if you look in here closely, you'll kind of see the teeth that are in there. Those teeth create streams. So instead of having kind of a fan effect going in our sprinkler system, it creates streams. And those bigger drops of water I'm talking about, and these can be about 60% more efficient than some of the standard nozzles that many of y'all may have, where you get that misting and that fogging occurring. Some other more new technology for those of y'all that do have high pressure in your irrigation system is converting your sprinkler heads. So this is a pop-up sprinkler head that has a special piece in the top. Just like your drip conversion adapter, this has a pressure reducer in it. So if you are one of those people that does have 100 PSI and you're getting that fogging and misting coming out of your sprinkler system, and you really don't want to spend the money of putting a pressure reducer back on the valve, you can change your sprinkler heads to these pressure regulating sprinkler heads to slow down the water. And what this does is, again, let's say you have that 5-head zone in your sprinkler system, you would need to change all 5 heads to these pressure regulating heads. And it balances the pressure between all 5 heads and puts out the same amount of pressure, so you no longer have that fogging and misting, and you have uniform precipitation rates in your landscape. So those are some of the newer technologies that are out there to make it more efficient. And some of the basic parts and components, we could go on for hours with all the different types of brands and some of the clever stuff they're coming out with. They even have micro drip tubing that's made out of soaker hose material. Again, we could go on and on about this, but that's the basics of your parts and components of your sprinkler system. If you have questions, feel free to reach out to us. Let us know if there's something specific in your system, and we'll do our best to help you out however we can. Back to you, Daniel.
Thanks, Patrick. And as Patrick mentioned, a lot of our different sprinkler devices, whether those are in-ground or those are hose-in sprinklers, are all going to put water out at several different rates. And so if you want to know exactly how long it takes your system with variations in pressure and components to put out about a 1/2 inch of water, one of the best things you can do is a catch can test. And what we're talking about in a catch can are really just tuna fish cans or cat food cans or any type of small container that is about 1 inch deep. And what we want to do is put those out throughout our landscape like we have here in one of our turf zones. We put 5 to 9 of these catch cans, and then we're going to run our system. And initially we want to run our system, test it for about 5 minutes, and see how long it takes those catch cans to fill up. Now, then if we are trying to, let's say, get 1/2 inch of water and we watered it for 5 minutes and we notice that it's about 1/4 full, then we know we'd have to run it for about 10 minutes to get that 1/2 inch of water. For your system, that may be 15 minutes. For another system, it may be 35 minutes, based on the different sprinkler heads that you have on your system. Now, the other great thing that a catch can test can do is help to estimate distribution uniformity. So if you notice that maybe your cat food cans or your catch cans on one side of your landscape are filling up a little bit faster, the ones on the other side of the zone are filling up a little bit slower, well, you may have some type of issue. Maybe it's a head that is slightly crooked, or maybe there's a branch or grass that is blocking the pattern, and you may need to go and address that. But what we would like to see is generally for these cans to be filling up evenly, and make sure that there's no debris that would be blocking any of that distribution uniformity. But basically, that's it. We're just setting out the cat food cans. We're running our sprinkler system to test it, and then we're estimating how long it takes to get that 1/2 inch of water, which for most instances is all we're going to need. Now, something else important to note is when you're running your zone for that test 5 minutes, at any point, if you see water running off your landscape, whether it's down the sidewalk or the driveway, then that is showing us that the irrigation system is putting out the water faster than our clay soils could absorb. And what we'd like to do is go ahead and pause. Typically, we're going to wait 30 to 60 minutes and allow that initial spray of water, that initial cycle, to infiltrate into our clay soil, to go further into the root zone. And then after that pause period, we're going to run our test again. And that is really the basis of what we call the cycle and soak method of irrigation. And we'll dig into that deeper as we go on to the presentation. But if you are doing a catch can test at any point, if you see that water running off the sidewalk, the driveway, it's meaning that the irrigation system is putting off water faster than the ground could absorb. That's a telltale sign we want to do catch can test paired with the cycle and soak method of irrigation. And a lot of times that means that we're going to, instead of running one long cycle of 20 minutes, we would break up 3 cycles of shorter intervals. But like I said, more about that here, and thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Daniel. I cannot express how important what Daniel just went over regarding catch can test is, especially going into this next part of today's program, where we're going to talk about irrigation best management practices. And we're going to talk about run times for your controllers, understanding that. So it's really important for you to do that catch can test to determine how long you actually need to run each zone, because everybody's system and delivery system is going to be a little different. Like you heard me talking about all the parts and components of your irrigation system. Well, a lot of your parts and components, depending on the brand and your water pressure, can always put out a little bit different or variations in your water that comes out of your sprinkler systems. So this next part of the program we call the best management practices, and we're going to cover some lists of the best management practices holistically through the landscape and specifically for irrigation, as you know, as sprinklers. And I'm going to talk to you and show you some of the best management practices that we even train licensed irrigators to follow, because it's really important for them to follow, especially being the ones that are actually helping people manage and repair their irrigation systems, just like you. So we want them to be better stewards of our water, just like we want you to be better stewards of your water. And you following a lot of the practices we're talking about today will save you ultimately a lot of money, not just in the expense of water, but also the expenses that you spend on those licensed irrigators, because they can be costly. And there's some terminology that I want to go over with you, just like we were talking about parts and terminology just before about irrigation system. But this one's very important for you to understand, and it's called a Vapo Transpiration. I jokingly call it kind of the Brangelina term of irrigation. I don't know that I should say Brangelina anymore, but anyways, we take terms like evaporation and transpiration, and we merge those words together and we get evapotranspiration. Evaporation is something hopefully you all remember, part of our water cycle, which is the water loss from surfaces, hard surfaces. So especially on hot days like today, where we have a lot of water going up into that atmosphere. And then transpiration is water loss for plants. This is where plants actually lose a lot of their moisture from their leaves, especially as it gets warmer. So the hotter it gets outside, the more water we have going up, and which is important for our water cycle. But as you already have been told and we've explained to you, our water cycle here in Texas has changed drastically over the years because of the installation of surface water like reservoirs and lakes. We've increased that surface water, that evaporation going up. So that's how we've changed our water cycle a little bit. And it's important for you to understand that evapotranspiration exceeds rainfall in almost all parts of Texas during that hot summer months. And irrigation, a lot of times, this is where we supplement that rainfall when we're not getting the rainfall we need for our plants. But when we talk about evaporation going up versus water coming down, when we have more going up, especially during times of the day like 10 a.m. and 6 p.m. that we've talked about, you should not be watering. That's when evapotranspiration is occurring the fastest and the most. And so why try to put more water out during those hours when you could be losing 50% of the water you're putting out into that landscape? This is very important for you to understand. That's why we say don't irrigate between 10 a.m. and 6 p.m. Early morning is the best time to irrigate your plants. And like you heard Daniel talking about, this is just one piece to a greater and bigger puzzle. So you've got to be putting all these pieces together. We want you to be efficient in your irrigation system. We want you to have that really good, sustainable, and independent landscape that you can really enjoy. And native and adaptive plants are key to this. Just like you heard all those great elements Daniel talked about, that we want the right plants for the right place. And some of the best benefits of those plants being that drought and that heat tolerance. Those are really key. And then, of course, less water overall. We want you to know it before you grow it. Be a better educated consumer. I was actually chatting with a friend on text earlier while I was waiting to come back onto the call. And he was asking and sending pictures of plants while he was at a nursery and trying to shop for those plants. And I'm really glad that he texted me because he was about to buy the wrong plants. That big box store that he was at was trying to offer him right at the register, we call it impulse buys, plants that aren't going to do well for him, not during our summers and not during our winters. So ultimately, he was going to fail with that plant. But what good is all this efficient irrigation if we're still planting the wrong plants? And that is the message that I know we're trying to push through to you, that this is, again, one piece to the bigger puzzle. We want you to take this even further, going into the maintenance practices, which we also call cultural practices in the landscape, so that you are really efficient with this. So when we talk about the right plants and irrigate, it all goes together. And when we train licensed irrigators, we also train landscape architects and horticulturalists like ourselves. We talk to them about bridging that gap. It's important for landscape architects and designers and horticulturalists to understand how we deliver that water to their landscape efficiently. And it's also very important for that irrigator to understand those plant water needs. That's kind of what we're doing in today's program, just like we do with professionals, bridging that gap, understanding the plant water needs and how we deliver that water efficiently to that landscape. So that's really what we're trying to do here. And that's what I mean by the piece of that puzzle. And we know, and we've talked about this statistic over and over again, and I think I mentioned it earlier as well in the program, that we know that 30 to 70% of our municipal water ends up outdoors. 30 to 70%. That municipal water that's been treated and filtered for our consumption and our needs safely for us, we put outdoors. We've taken advantage of that municipal water and that faucet for outdoor use. And as a horticulturalist, I'm here to tell you that should be alarming for you, even at 50%. And in some cases, even at 30% if it's a really large property. And that's why it's important for us to be planting those right plants and using efficient irrigation at all times, and reprogramming our brains, understanding what irrigation, what your sprinklers are designed to do. And they are there to design as to supplement the lack of rainfall and not the other way around. This is why in our past in our programs, and we'll continue doing it, we do a program for new homeowners, people that have never owned properties before, never managed a sprinkler system or a landscape before. And we talk to them about understanding that, yes, the city gives you 2 days to water out of the week. And those are permanent water restrictions. They're not really restrictions as kind of like mandates. We don't want to think that they're telling you not to use your water. The same reason we don't say conservation as much as we say efficiency, because we're not telling you not to use your water. We're just telling you to be as efficient as possible with it, especially outdoors. And that's why it's important for you to remember this and reprogram your brain. But like I was saying, that the city may say those are your 2 days of week to water. They're just saying those are the 2 days you could water. That doesn't mean that you actually need to water those 2 days. And that's what we're going to go over in these best management practices. But really, we want you to be only watering once a week, only when needed. In 2020, out of 52 weeks out of the year, it was recommended you only water 14 weeks out of that year. And of those 14 weeks, not one of those weeks was even a full inch of water. That's why it's important for you to get on this Water is Awesome website and get the information that you need as to when you need to water. They put out great, helpful information. And that's why we're here also to help you understand your irrigation system, because we know the number one problem in the irrigation or in the landscape is, in fact, overwatering. People don't understand how much their landscape needs or how much water they're actually putting out in their landscape. And I've already given this analogy once, but I want you to understand that we know the average residential irrigation system or sprinkler system is about a 6-zone pop-up sprinkler system. And if we run all 6 zones at about 15 minutes, we're using in the upwards of 1,800 to 3,800 gallons of water. That's how much water we're putting out of that sprinkler system. And people don't look at the actual gallon usage on their water bill. They just look at the price. And that's why we really want you to be looking at that gallon usage on your water bill and not just the price. So you really do understand the water consumption your whole property, your whole family is using. Improper design and installation. This is something that we cannot express enough, that if you are having a new irrigation system installed, it's very important for you to hire a licensed irrigator to do that. We have the Texas Irrigation Association, you have the Dallas Irrigation Association, the Lone Star Irrigation Association, and they all have resources on their website to help you find a licensed contractor if you are looking at major repairs or to install a new irrigation system, because we still see systems that are installed very poorly. Things like requiring a backflow device, that is required and necessary to make sure that contaminated water doesn't get siphoned back into your home pipes. I was actually visiting a property not too long ago that had a really, really old system put in many years ago. But even when we still required backflow devices and they didn't have one, I immediately expressed to them that they needed to quit using their irrigation system, immediately cap it off and put a backflow on, because they could have contaminated water coming back in their home. We still see zones where the zone is irrigating flower beds and turf grass. Those need to be separated. They have two different water requirements. We don't want to be watering them together. And then no improper scheduling practices. The best time of day to water is early morning, period, unless you use drip irrigation. And drip irrigation could be used in the evenings and overnight, because we don't want the water sitting on the leaves of the plants all night long. The plant's leaves do not need water. And so we don't want to have that water sitting on the leaves of the plants, because we know 90% of our plant diseases are fungal related. So when we're inviting fungal problems into our landscape by cool nights and a lot of moisture, you're increasing your chances of having disease and insect problems, because with disease weakens the plants and invites the insects. So try to reduce those problems in your landscape by watering early in the morning, and then no routine maintenance. You're going to hear me say this multiple times through this program. It is so important for you to be checking your irrigation system. We have more existing irrigation systems than we do systems being installed. And if your system is going off at 12 or 5 o'clock in the morning, you may not know that you have a broken sprinkler head shooting 12 feet up in the air until you get that large water bill. And it's very important for you to understand that and check your irrigation system every month that you're using it, without leaving it in the auto position and not knowing what's occurring. Because although you may get that big water bill with that big gallon usage, that doesn't mean the city's going to credit you that money back. And you shouldn't hope or depend on that occurring. Even the smartest controller cannot compensate for a poorly designed and or maintained irrigation system. Maintained means you checking that system and maintaining it properly, but also being involved. You know, smart controllers are wonderful, and the luxury of being able to, conveniently operate them from your cell phone has made life very easy, especially for the contractor. I can't tell you how much life has been easier being able to control irrigation systems and adjustments remotely instead of going to every single property. But it does no good if you're not involved. So many people say, well, can I, operate my irrigation controller manually, kind of like I did in the past, set the kitchen timer, go move the water hose. Absolutely, you can do that. I do that. I don't feel comfortable leaving my controller in the auto position, because if I jokingly say that if it's not written down on a Post-it or on my to-do list, I'm probably going to forget it. I'm one of those people that I'm a big to-do lister and, Post-its and give myself reminders, but I will forget. And I do have an operable rain and freeze sensor, but that doesn't mean I want to take the chance of my irrigation system running, for example, tonight, if I know that we have a good chance of rain tomorrow. I might be able to wait, turn off my system, and then when I get rain, I don't have to run that system. I don't have to spend the money on the water, and I don't have to waste that water in the landscape, because I'm getting that rainwater. And the quality of the rainwater far exceeds our tap water. And that is not anything against our water treatment facilities and the people and the infrastructure that make that water safe for us to drink. But we know that our municipal water is a hard water. Hard water can be hard on irrigation parts. And also, plants don't like it as much as they do rainwater. So it doesn't have all those hard elements like calcium and lime and salt. Whereas rainwater can be slightly acidic and doesn't have any of those hard components. I always ask people, does your landscape look as vibrant after a nice rainstorm as it does after your irrigation system goes off? And a majority of the times people say no. And that really does speak volumes of the quality of the water. And that's why we're also big proponents of rainwater harvesting. It makes a big difference, especially if you are a vegetable gardener or something. That quality of water with the rainwater harvesting makes a big difference. All right, so going through a list of best management practices, that's what we call BMPs. These are practices holistically across your entire landscape. Number one, obviously, is water only when required or when needed. That means paying attention to weather. That means if we had rain, make sure your sprinkler system is not in the auto position, because that rain and freeze sensor can dry out very quickly, especially on hot summer days. So your sprinkler could go off 2 days after we had a 2-inch rainstorm when it didn't need to go off. So you watering only when required. And if you really want to be involved like I am and test your soil to find out when you need to water, invest in a soil moisture meter like you see on the screen here. If you can't find them, I know some people have had hard times finding them in the big box stores and even in the local nurseries. We do have them available on our website at rootedin.com. It's a great tool to have for your potted plants, your vegetable garden, your lawn, your landscape beddings, because you can actually, it's so easy. You can see on the screen, it says dry, moist, or wet. And you obviously, it even makes it color coded. You want to stay in the green. You want to be in the green area, not in the red and not in the blue, because then it will tell you you don't have to water. And when you water less often and deeper, you're encouraging a deeper root system. And that's what we want you to do. So with that soil moisture meter, I always check down past the first inch or two of soil and mulch, because we know that can dry out at 100-degree weather. But that doesn't mean there's not moisture below there. And the less often I water and the deeper that I water, the deeper root system I encourage. So you see here on this slide, on the picture on the left, that deep root system of that turf grass has been a grass that's been watered less often, meaning letting it dry out at the surface and force those roots to do what they're designed to do. Basically, I like to say, don't allow the roots to be lazy. Make them seek out that nutrients in those water, that moisture that's deep down in that soil. It also makes that plant less dependent of you and less dependent of that sprinkler system. So the grass on the right obviously has been a grass that's been watered 2 to 3 times a week on 5-6 minutes a spurt. You're just holding all that moisture at the surface. That plant has no reason to grow deep roots. And water slowly. This is where drip irrigation and cycle and soak really come in handy. Cycle and soak is a practice that you heard us talk about where you run through multiple programs in your irrigation system. The first cycle kind of breaks the tension in the soil, and then you can go back and water in shorter spurts, because our clay soil doesn't allow a lot of water in at once. So introducing water very slowly with things like drip irrigation is a great way to introduce that moisture. And then maintaining mulch throughout your whole landscape. It's recommended 2 to 4 inches. I would tell you to do 4, because if you do 2 inches, within a few months, you're going to go, where did my mulch go? But if you do 4, it sounds like a lot, but then it's kind of fluffy when you put it out in the landscape, and it settles down to about 2.5 inches. And think of that like insulation around your plants. It holds moisture. It controls weeds by smothering them. It cools during the summer, warms during the winter. I mean, the list goes on with the benefits. Just stay away from some of the synthetics like your rubber mulches. Designed for efficiency. This is for those of y'all that are going to have a new system installed, or you're going to retrofit for drip irrigation or something like that. You want this system to irrigate your landscape as efficiently as possible, meaning no water getting on concrete, putting the water exactly where it needs to go at the root of the plant, not necessarily at the leaves of the plants. That's what we mean for efficiency. Install per state and local specifications. That's if you're hiring a contractor, hopefully a licensed irrigator, and one that will follow the state and local. And I'll talk about some of those in just a second. Water without creating runoff. We know that some misting and fogging will occur, but as soon as that water starts traveling down the concrete, that's when we need to shut it off. That's the limit for our soil, telling us that we can't accept any more water. And why keep dumping water out on your landscape that's going to end up going down the drain, literally. And then I told you I was going to mention it more than once. Check your irrigation system on a monthly basis while you are getting using it because you get your water bill on a monthly basis. Now, so this list right here is a list of 3 best management practices. These are the best management practices that we present to licensed irrigators during continuing education seminars that we teach for them. We teach them, number 1, design the irrigation system to be as efficient as possible, to deliver water precisely. And with these new nozzles and everything out on the market, you can get very precise with this. And I'm going to tell you about some of this in just a second. Installing to meet the design criteria, meaning being as efficient as a possible. You know, if there's any designer out there that said that their landscape went in at 100%, or their irrigation system went at 100% as they designed it, they are lying because no design has ever gone in at 100%. Even building a building, there's always changes, there's always edits, there's always finding a root below ground, or that maybe the CAD drawing or whatever it is might have been off a few inches. It happens. Human error being the biggest part of that. And then best management practice number 3, like I told you, is the most important. And this is managing that irrigation system after it's installed, because we know we have far more existing irrigation systems than we do new systems being installed. Making sure things are repaired very quickly, adjustments are made as necessary, and scheduling the irrigation system seasonally and monitoring that system. You know, my colleague Daniel and I, we talk a lot about a saying that we grew up hearing, and that's the gardener's shadow is the best fertilizer. And I think what that means, or how I interpretate that and read that, is that if you want to be successful at this, you're coming to these programs to learn about efficient irrigation, proper plants, you know, all these great practices, and we're thrilled that you're excited about it. But you have to be involved. You have to be present in this process in order for it to really be efficient and really be successful at this. You can't plant a plant and walk away and hope that it lives, because you can return it on that 1-year warranty. You can't work on all this and try to make an efficient irrigation system if you plan on just leaving in auto and walking away all summer. That's not how this works. Being involved and being better stewards of our water and our environment is what this involves. And that presence is what I was referring to. Now, rain and freeze sensors. Just now realizing my picture is kind of off to the right. Rain and freeze sensors are required per state requirements. They turn off, depending on the brand, at about 38 degrees. We saw this a lot during the Snowmageddon of 2021. But what I want to go back and show you is these sensors at the top of them have a little catch can at the top, and about 3/8 of an inch of rainfall, and then a little temperature sensor, and about 38 degrees will turn off your irrigation system for you. This is that human error I was talking about, where you may be out of town and not knowing that it's raining, or got down to freezing while you were out of town. Or you may be forgetting that, oh, it's going to rain and I'm out to dinner, or something like that. Or you simply went to sleep and we had a rogue storm that popped up and started pouring rain all over our landscape. Well, this avoids these mishaps like this, and it also avoids liability on your property. If this causes an accident with this freezing precipitation, the property responsible for it is responsible and liable for any damages. Also, wasting water when it's raining. Don't forget what your sprinkler system is designed to do. It's designed to supplement the lack of rainfall. So don't let it go off while it's raining outside. Please don't let it go off, because I don't think any of y'all would do this. I'm hoping there's a really good reason why this gentleman felt the need to wash his car while it's raining outside. But it's a perfect example of why you also wouldn't be irrigating your landscape while it's raining outside. Now, let's talk really quickly about each one of your delivery devices in your system. You heard me go over all of them in the parts and components, and I want to go over this again so you understand their output per minute. Remember, spray irrigation goes off of gallons per minute. Drip irrigation goes off gallons per hour. So the rotor sprayers, which is the picture on the left, these can put out about 9 gallons per minute. 9 gallons of water per minute. Now, the difference is these actually can be very efficient delivery systems because they're covering a very large area. There are some rotor heads that can spray 30 feet out and cover that full radius and circumference of that area. So 9 gallons per minute covering that much square footage can actually be really efficient. Now, some really old rotors, if I would say if they're about 10 years or older, it might be time to replace those and upgrade those, because now they have rotors that you can adjust without the key at the top. They're a lot more efficient, putting out bigger drops of water. You heard me talk about in parts and components. Bigger drops of water are very important because they fall, they're heavier. You don't get that misting and fogging. And then I actually have this reversed. I'm just now realizing this. So our standard pop-up spray heads that pop up out of the ground, they can put up in the upwards of 3 gallons of water per minute. Whereas the multi-stream rotors that I told you about, these can put out 1.5 gallons per minute. Multi-stream rotors play a huge part in efficiency in our heavy clay soil, because just like drip, they put out less water per minute. They're bigger drops of water, so they fall. And all you're changing again is that little bitty nozzle at the top of your sprinkler head. That's the efficiency. So changing out your your pop-up sprinkler heads to multi-stream rotors, that right there is a big change that you can put in your system to make your system more efficient. These nozzles, like you can see in this picture, put out that misting and that fogging. Your windows get wet, your car gets wet, whereas multi-stream rotors are 60% more efficient than those standard nozzles. About 1.5 gallons per minute, so half the water per minute, and very, very efficient. I have some fun videos that I've taken over the years, and even when I turn on the sprinklers in my front landscape to check them, because I really don't have to use them ever. It's always funny, people walking by going, "What are those?" They're so fun to watch the way they stream throughout the landscape. And they're very efficient. The technology actually came from testing pop-up nozzles in windy situations, and then they quickly realized, wow, these are really efficient nozzles just in general. Drip irrigation, like I said earlier on, this is the most efficient form of irrigation, 90% compared to 60% at our best pop-up sprinkler system. Very easy to install. We teach you how to install them off of in many different scenarios, typically exempt from days of watering, meaning if you want to watch your irrigation, your drip irrigation go on Sunday morning and your day to water is Saturday, you can do that, but you still don't want to water between 10 a.m. and 6 p.m. Because we'll have that Vapo Transpiration going up. They're typically exempt, or they typically reduce the evaporation because it's covered up with mulch, out of sight, out of mind, reduces the loss from the fertilizer and the nutrients in your soil, and the hook being it saves you money. That's the hook. Subsurface drip. I wanted to throw this in because so many of y'all may have subsurface drip, especially if you live in newer communities. Subsurface drip was designed to be 3 to 4 inches below turf grass. Not really necessary. We don't need it in landscape beds. It's really designed for turf. This has come leaps and bounds better than it used to be. There's actually designed where each little emitter, each one of those tiny little holes in the drip irrigation acts like a backflow, preventing soil and water from coming back and clogging those emitters in there. But it also has a little copper sheath. That copper sheath roots, plants don't like copper. So they actually grow around it and away from it instead of the roots growing in and hindering that emitter and clogging it up over time. In the state of Texas, all parkways and medians 48 inches or less are required to be subsurface drip or drip, no longer being spray. They don't want that spray anymore spraying over the sidewalks or over the curb, so it has to be subsurface drip or drip irrigation in general if you don't have turf grass in your parkway. This shows you just a diagram. This was Frito-Lay Corporation. We're very proud of their sustainability and how they've come around in their corporate offices and now spreading out to their satellite offices and doing more sustainable practices. They actually put subsurface drip under their turf grass. Subsurface drip can even be installed on existing lawns by this trencher. So this is a trencher that can be rented or purchased by irrigators. And what it actually does is lay the drip tubing for you. It digs or trenches down about 3 to 4 inches. And as you can see here, it's laying the drip tubing. They can actually hang the spool of drip tubing right here, and it pulls the drip tubing out and lays it below soil. And then you see how the soil is coming back out. It covers it up for you. It literally just does all the work for you. Your lawn will look a little bit like a zebra stripe for the first 2 to 3 weeks, but then it grows in very quickly. Drip out of sight, out of mind, no more spray irrigation. The only disadvantage to subsurface drip these days is that you do have to let go of being able to do aeration on the lawn. So if you have a lawn that gets a lot of foot traffic because you have to have a soccer or lacrosse field in your backyard, or the dog has a trail, you might refrain from doing subsurface drip because you can't do that aeration, which will be needed for soil compaction. Now, the irrigation controller settings, based on the delivery system that I've talked about and based on what Daniel talked to you about with the catch can test, we can now determine how long we need to run different deliveries in our irrigation system. So if you look at this chart that we put together for you, this is based on 1/2 inch of water, not 1 inch of water. And it's broken down for you by the sprinkler, the spray, the rotors, multi-stream, and drip. The run times as examples for you. So if we run 6 minutes on spray, 13 on rotors, 25 on multi-stream, and 25 on drip. The number of cycles. Now, this is based on the program. So programs A, B, C, and D on your controller, how many times that we would have to run through multiple programs to get to that 1/2 inch of water. So if you see here, spray and rotors are going to require the most because they put out the most water per minute. So they are going to cause the most runoff. So we have to run more cycles to allow that water to soak in. And in cycle and soak, you want to leave about 30 to 60 minutes between each run time. So if you run through your system all through, like on the spray, at 6 minutes, once you run through, you want about 30 to 60 minutes before you start over the next program. So here we need more than 2 cycles. But if you look down here, multi-stream and drip require the less cycles because they're putting out less gallons per minute. In fact, drip is gallons per hour, sometimes as low as 0.6 gallons per hour. So it's putting out water very slowly. We can put less cycles out because that clay soil will accept it. The run times are longer with multi-stream and drip because we're putting out less gallons. But in order to get that water as deep as we possibly can and run less cycles, you can see the benefit here to using these efficient systems. And if you change all your turf to multi-stream rotors and put drip in all your flower beds, 90% and 60% efficient, you're going to be doing that much better than you are now. So look into this. And if you're interested, like I said, we teach you on how to convert to drip in your irrigation system. Whether you have a sprinkler system or you don't have a sprinkler system, we can teach you how to put drip in your landscape. So there's no necessarily a irrigation system required. The whole point of today's program, the whole point of everything I'm talking to you about with parts and components and best management practices, and Daniel talking to you about plant and plant water needs, overall, the message is we want you to be better soil moisture managers. Be responsible for checking for that moisture. There's so many different types of moisture meters here. I put these up here to show you that we even have professionals and teaching them how to do a little bit more complicated soil moisture meters and checking for that moisture. You know, that's a great way for teaching people that they can go longer a lot of times without running their irrigation system, even though it's hot and 100 degrees out there. So think of yourself as being better stewards of our water, being better soil moisture managers, so that you can look at these best management practices as a way of managing your landscape and not just kind of coasting through, especially if you really want to be successful at this. So again, I thank you all for joining us today. I'm going to pass it back over to Daniel. If you have any questions, all of my email and all of our social media, our website, everything is listed on here. We're here for you to help you be more successful in this in general and put all these pieces of this puzzle together. Thank you again.
Thanks, Patrick. Yeah, you know, everything Patrick talked about is so spot on, and really to take that information and to apply it in the landscape. I know that you are going to see savings in water, but you're also going to see healthier plant material. And in addition to those tips and tricks, there's also a tool that our partners at Water is Awesome have that I think is really going to do a good job of putting that all together. Now, if you visit waterisawesome.com, the website that is run and managed by Tarrant Regional Water District, North Texas Municipal Water District, and our friends at Dallas Water, I've got a lot of information and resources that are just at your fingertips. So tips on irrigation, but they also have tips on weekly watering advice where you can go choose from 2 different tools where, based on local weather station data, you type in your information there, and then they will help estimate, in your area when it's rained or what the forecast is like, what the soil moisture is like, and if you actually need to turn on your irrigation system. But then you can, based on what type of system you have and what components you have, if they're, multi-stream rotors or spray nozzles or drip irrigation, how long you actually need to run your system for. So really it kind of takes the guesswork out of when to water and for how much. It's really, I think, a great tool. You sign up for it once, you can either pick text message or email, but 2 different sources there. There's just the Water is Awesome kind of calculated there, and there's also watermyyard.org, depending on kind of where you live. But visit their website and check out that information. It is a great tool. I promise you, they don't spam you with anything. It's only that weekly watering advice. And this is surprising to a lot of people. I mentioned earlier, sometimes people water their landscapes 2 to 3 times more than their plants actually need. But last year, I believe at my house, it was about 13 times that they recommended watering based on the actual soil moisture and how much our plant needs between those rainfall events and playing into a Vapo Transpiration, the wind and the heat and all that. 13 times of about a half an inch of water. One time, I think it was a 3/4 inch of water at my house. And so I think most of my neighbors are probably watering, 2 times a week, and they're watering for an inch or more. And some of them, not following the watering guidelines, are probably watering more than that. And there's really no sense to it. In fact, a lot of times that is a detriment to the plants if you're over applying water. So as a horticulturist, like Patrick and I say, really what we want to do is be soil moisture managers. And if we can keep just the right amount of water in that root zone without applying too much, then our plants are really going to do the rest. And it takes a lot of stress off of us in terms of maintenance. Now, again, I wanted to thank everybody for joining us. I see we have some questions popping up in the comments, and we'll go ahead and stay on and type those answers, Patrick and I and our other colleagues at Rooted In. But if you have any questions at all about anything that we've talked about, please go ahead and ask your comment or your question, make a comment, questions too. And please join us for our next program. We are going to teach more programs with our friends at Water is Awesome. Be sure to like the page and to follow the page. Visit their website, waterisawesome.com. You can also visit rootedin.com and follow us on social media. If you have any questions, whether that's tonight, 2 weeks from now, 2 years from now, we are happy to help any way we can. On behalf of Patrick and myself, we want to thank you again for joining us, and have a great evening.